Verity Combs is counting a woman's pulse by lamplight, two fingers pressed light against the wrist, her lips moving without sound as she marks the beats against the second hand of a small brass watch balanced open on the quilt. The room smells of beeswax and boiled linen. Outside the cabin window, rain has been falling since before dawn, the kind of steady gray rain that Texas hill country gets in April, unhurried, patient, filling the world one drop at a time. The woman on the bed is Dolly Ferris, 22 years old, 8 months carrying her first child, and Verity has been coming to check on her twice a week since February, because Dolly's hips are narrow and her first labor is close, and a careful midwife does not wait for trouble to introduce itself. "Baby's turned proper," Verity says, drawing the quilt back down over Dolly's belly. "Heads down. That's good news, and it's the news I came for." Dolly lets out a breath she'd been holding since Verity's hands went still a moment before. "You always go quiet like that. Scares me half to death." "I go quiet so I can count," Verity says, folding her stethoscope of rolled linen back into her bag. Talking and counting don't share a mouth well. Cedar Bend sat where the Brazos bent hard around a limestone bluff, 41 families strung along a single muddy street with the schoolhouse at one end and the mill at the other, and it had known Verity Combs for 6 years now, since she'd come west a widow with a satchel of instruments and a dead husband's small inheritance, and had set herself up, without asking anyone's leave, as the settlement's midwife. They called her that plainly, and mostly that was all they saw in her. A quiet, capable woman who came when called, delivered babies, set the occasional broken finger, and otherwise kept to the small frame house near the mill where she grew herbs in neat rows and kept her instruments boiled and ready on a folded cloth beside her stove. What they did not know, because midwifery does not advertise itself beyond the birthing room, was that 6 years of catching babies in flood season had taught Verity Combs a great deal about water, about how creeks rise, about how a river tells you its intentions long before it announces them outright, if you know to watch the color of it, the sound of it, the way birds behave before it happens, the way the air itself seems to thicken and hush in the hour before a real flood arrives. She had learned this the way she had learned everything useful in her life, by paying close attention to things other people found too ordinary to notice, and by being present, again and again, in the exact moments when a small, overlooked detail turned out to matter enormously. Her husband, Amos Combs, no relation to old Amos Teal, though the coincidence of names had made her smile the first time she'd heard it, had brought her west from Kentucky in 1866 and had died 3 years later of a fever that came on fast and left just as fast, taking him and leaving her with a satchel of instruments she had learned to use at his side, and a stubborn refusal to let his death be the end of anything useful she still had to offer. She had thought, in those early months of widowhood, that Cedar Bend might not want a woman practicing medicine of any kind, midwifery least controversial among the things she knew, and so she had begun there, quietly, and let her competence speak for itself one birth at a time, until competence became reputation, and reputation became simply the way things were. 6 years was long enough for a town to stop wondering about a person and start merely relying on her, which was, Verity had come to understand, its own particular kind of loneliness, trusted completely with the most fragile moments of people's lives, and asked about almost nothing else. She noticed the color first, on her walk home from Dolly Ferris's cabin. The Brazos, usually a clear green-brown this time of year, had gone the color of poured coffee, thick and fast, carrying branches she hadn't seen it carry in the 6 years she'd lived beside it. She stopped on the low bridge at the edge of town and watched the water a long moment, the way another woman might watch a fever climb on a child's face, reading something in it that required no explanation to itself, only to everyone who hadn't learned to read it. It had been raining upriver for 4 days. She knew this because travelers had said so, because the mail rider had come in soaked to the bone twice that week and complained of washed-out crossings north of the county line. 4 days of rain in the hills meant water coming down that hadn't fallen in Cedar Bend at all, water that arrived all at once, without warning, hours after the rain itself had passed, arriving with a violence that had nothing to do with how gentle the local rain might look. She went straight to the mill, where Silas Grant ran both the grinding wheel and, by informal agreement of the town, most of its practical decisions. Silas was a broad, sun-weathered man of 40, good with machinery and livestock and the business of keeping Cedar Bend fed, and he had never in 6 years sought Verity Combs' opinion on anything that wasn't a birth. "The river's wrong," she told him, standing in the mill doorway with rain still dripping from her shawl. "It's carrying debris it shouldn't carry this early in the season, and it's the color of the water they get in the hill country after 4 days of hard rain. I think it's coming up fast, faster than it looks from here." Silas glanced out at the gray afternoon, unremarkable rain falling steady but not hard. "It's rained here 2 days, Mrs. Combs. That's all I've seen." "It's not what's fallen here that worries me," she said. "It's what fell upriver 4 days ago and is only now arriving. Water like that doesn't announce itself slow. It comes all at once." Silas rubbed the back of his neck, the look of a man being asked to disrupt a mill schedule on the word of a midwife. "We've had high water before. The bridge held through worse." "This isn't about the bridge holding," she said. "It's about how much time we have before it doesn't, and I'd rather we spent that time moving the schoolhouse children and the Ferris family and anyone low along the creek than argue about whether I've got cause to worry." He didn't move quickly, not then. He said something about not wanting to alarm the town over a hunch, about the crossing having survived 3 seasons of spring rain already, and Verity did not press him further because she had learned, delivering babies in houses where the husband doubted her right up until the child was crowning, that some men needed the proof arriving before they'd believe the warning. What she did instead was walk the low street herself, cabin to cabin, knocking, speaking plainly, telling each family what she'd seen in the water and what she thought it meant, and letting them decide for themselves what to do with the telling. Most nodded politely and went back to their supper. A few, the ones who'd farmed this bottomland long enough to have their own memories of high water, began quietly moving what mattered most to higher shelves without being told twice. It was Amos Teal who believed her first, fully, without hesitation. Amos was 66, had run a ferry crossing on the Brazos for 30 years before his knees gave out, and knew the river the way Verity knew a laboring body, by its rhythms, by what was ordinary and what was not. "Coffee-colored and carrying branches this early," Amos said, when she found him mending nets on his porch. "That's headwater flood, Mrs. Combs, not local rain. You've got the right of it. I'd wager we've got 2, maybe 3 hours before it's serious, and less than that before the low crossing goes under." "Silas doesn't want to hear it," Verity said. Amos set down his net. "Silas has never had to pull a drowned man out of that river. I have, 3 times. He rose, joints stiff, reaching for his coat. "Let's you and me start moving people. He'll come round when the water tells him what you already told him." Between her rounds of the low street, Verity returned once to her own small house, moving quickly through it, lifting her dried herbs and her wrapped instruments, and her late husband's old medical ledger up onto the highest shelf she owned, not because she expected the water to climb so far, but because a careful person prepares for the flood she fears, not only the flood she expects. She filled every jar and pot she owned with clean water from the well, and set them along the back wall away from the windows, because she had learned in 6 years of tending births in every kind of weather that clean water becomes the scarcest thing in a flooded town almost as fast as it becomes the most dangerous thing outside it. She packed her satchel heavier than usual, more linen than an ordinary birth would call for, more of the tallow salve she kept for burns and scrapes, a second roll of clean bandage wound tight and dry inside oiled cloth to keep it from the wet, because something in the color of that water had told her this particular day would ask more of her satchel than most days did. The rain thickened through the afternoon, and by 5 o'clock the Brazos had climbed the second marker stone on the bridge post, a stone that Amos said hadn't been touched in 4 years, and the low crossing that connected the schoolhouse side of Cedar Bend to the rest of the settlement had begun to disappear beneath brown water, moving fast enough to carry fence rails. The schoolhouse sat on the low side, and inside it, 11 children remained past the normal hour because their teacher, a young woman named Ellen Marsh, had kept them working through the rain rather than send them out into it, not understanding yet how quickly the crossing behind them was closing. Verity reached the schoolhouse with Amos a half step behind her, both of them soaked through, and found Ellen Marsh at the window, her face gone pale at what she was only now beginning to understand about the water rising along the yard fence. "The crossing's near gone," Ellen said. I didn't think it would come so fast." "It never does, until it does," Verity said, already moving through the room, counting heads, sorting the children by size and age with a glance the way she'd sort a birthing kit by what would be needed first. "We're not crossing back the way we came. We're going up, to the Ferris place. It sits highest on this side, and the barn loft will hold us dry until the water turns." She organized them the way she organized a difficult birth, calm instruction over panic, the youngest children paired with the oldest, hands held, no one moving alone. Amos took the lead child by the hand and started them walking the fence line, the only ground on that side still holding above the rising water, toward the Ferris homestead a quarter-mile off. Behind them, the schoolhouse's low porch step disappeared beneath brown water even as the last child cleared the yard gate, and Ellen Marsh looked back once, understanding now exactly how close the telling had come to arriving too late. Halfway along the fence line, the second trouble found them. A boy near the back of the line, 8 years old and named Tucker Vance, went down hard in the mud where the water had already begun undercutting the fence post beside him, his ankle twisting beneath him with a small, sickening give. Verity was beside him before his cry had fully left his throat, both hands moving over his ankle with the same careful, exact pressure she used to feel for a baby's position through a mother's belly, reading the shape of the injury through her fingertips rather than guessing at it. "Not broken," she said, mostly to herself, then louder, to Ellen and the frightened boy both. "Turned bad, but not broken. We'll bind it and he'll walk on it slower, but he'll walk." She had no proper splint out here in the open, no clean linen bandage rolled and ready the way she kept them at home, and so she did what a midwife learns to do when the tools she wants are not the tools she has. She used what was on her, unwinding the long cotton ties from her own apron, wrapping them snug and even around Tucker's ankle, over his boot, cinching them with a firm, practical knot that would hold through the walking still ahead of them. "Lean on me," Amos told the boy, crouching to let Tucker's arm drape over his shoulder. "I've walked worse ground than this, on worse legs than yours." They kept moving, the line of children slower now but unbroken, the water at their heels the whole way, rising visibly along the fence line even as they climbed toward higher ground and the distant shape of the Ferris barn. They found Dolly Ferris on her own porch, gripping the rail with both hands, her face twisted with something that wasn't fear of the water at all. "It's early," Dolly said, through gritted teeth. "The baby. It's too early for this." Verity was beside her in 3 strides, hands already moving with the particular quick calm she brought to every birth she'd ever caught, checking, assessing, reading what the body was telling her the way she'd read the river an hour before. "How long have the pains been coming?" "An hour. Maybe more. I thought it was the walking, the excitement." "It isn't the walking," Verity said. "This baby's decided today's the day, flood or no flood, and we're not going to argue with it. We need her inside, dry ground and time." The barn loft, reached by ladder before the yard itself went under, became in the space of 20 minutes a birthing room and a shelter both. 11 children huddled in blankets at one end, one boy's bound ankle propped carefully on a folded feed sack, Dolly Ferris laboring at the other end, and Verity Combs moving between all 3 like a woman managing a household she'd run her whole life, though she'd never in 6 years faced quite this particular combination of crisis at once. She had Amos and Ellen keep the children calm with quiet talk and what dry bread could be found in the loft stores, and she had Dolly's husband, Warren, who'd come running from the fields at the first sign of trouble, hold his wife's shoulders steady while she worked, his face white with a fear he was trying hard not to show his wife. Outside, the water kept rising, visible now through the loft's small hay door, brown and fast, and carrying whole fence sections downstream. the schoolhouse roof barely showing above the flood where it had stood an hour before. Verity did not look at the water more than she had to. She had learned, long before this day, that a midwife who watches the storm instead of the mother loses both. The third trouble came without warning, the way the worst ones always did. Ellen Marsh, moving too quickly between the huddled children and the small stove Amos had gotten burning in the loft's stone corner, caught her sleeve on a splintered hay bale and stumbled, her forearm dragging hard across the stove's hot iron edge before she could catch herself. She did not cry out loudly, more from shock than restraint, and it was one of the older children who called for Verity, small voice cracking with alarm. Verity crossed the loft in 4 strides, both hands already reaching for Ellen's arm, turning it gently into the lantern light to see the burn clearly, a raw red line along the inside of her forearm, painful but shallow, the kind of wound that would heal clean if it was tended properly and would fester badly if it was not. "Hold still," Verity said, already reaching into her satchel for the last of her clean linen and the small jar of rendered tallow she carried for exactly this kind of injury. "This will sting worse before it stings less. That's the way of it." She worked quickly, cleaning the burn with water still warm from the stovepot, dressing it with a thin layer of tallow and a wrapped linen bandage, tying it off with the same practical, unhurried knot she'd used on Tucker's ankle not an hour before, because a body in trouble, whether from a fall, a burn, or a baby arriving early, wanted the same things from the person tending it: calm hands, clear instruction, and no wasted motion. "3 of you needing tending in one afternoon," Amos said quietly, passing behind her with an armful of dry kindling. "Good thing the town's got more than 1 midwife's worth of patience in that satchel of yours." "It isn't patience," Verity said, tying off the last of Ellen's bandage. "It's just knowing what comes next before it arrives, same as the river." The labor moved fast, faster than a first birth had any right to, and Verity worked with what she had: clean linen from her own satchel, boiled water from the small stove, and the steady, practiced calm of a woman who had done this hundreds of times in rooms far calmer than this one, and had learned that the calm itself was half the medicine. "One more," Verity said, her hands sure, her voice low and even beneath the sound of rain hammering the barn roof. "Just one more, Dolly. You're doing exactly right." The child came into the world at the height of the flood, in a hayloft with 11 frightened schoolchildren huddled 20 feet away, one boy's ankle bound and propped on a feed sack, a schoolteacher's freshly bandaged arm cradled carefully in her lap, and a river swallowing the town below. And its first cry was loud enough that even the children stopped their whispering to listen. Dolly Ferris wept and laughed, both at once, and Warren pressed his forehead to his wife's and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. Somewhere behind them, in the hay-strewn dark of the loft's far corner, one of the older schoolgirls began, very softly, to hum a hymn her mother sang at wash time, and one by one the other children took it up in whispers, not because anyone told them to, but because a room full of frightened people will often reach, without deciding to, for whatever small ordinary comfort is nearest at hand. Ellen Marsh, her bandaged arm cradled carefully against her chest, hummed along with them, and Amos, tending the little stove fire, kept time with a slow nod of his head, and for a few minutes the barn loft held something that was not quite celebration and not quite relief, but stood very close to both. Verity wrapped the newborn in clean linen she'd kept dry against her own body beneath her shawl, for exactly this reason, and laid the baby against Dolly's chest, and only then did she allow herself to look back toward the hay door, toward the water, toward the town she could no longer see the bottom half of. Silas Grant arrived an hour later, having finally understood what the river meant when it took the mill's lower storeroom and half his own dooryard, arriving soaked and shaken at the Ferris barn with 3 other men who'd followed his lead once his doubt had finally broken. He climbed the ladder and found the loft warm with lamplight, children fed and settled, a boy's ankle bound neatly, a schoolteacher's arm dressed and resting, a newborn asleep against her mother's chest, and Verity Combs kneeling by the hay door with a cup of water, watching the flood crest and begin, at last, to slow. "You were right," Silas said, It cost him something to say it plainly, and he said it plainly anyway. About all of it. "I didn't want to be," Verity said. "I only wanted enough time believed to matter." "You had it," Amos said, from where he sat with a sleeping child's head against his shoulder. "Every minute you needed. Just took some of us longer to give it than others." The water held them through the night, the loft warm and close and crowded, children sleeping in uneasy shifts against the hay. Dolly and her newborn tended every hour by lamplight. Tucker's bound ankle checked once more before dawn, to be sure the swelling hadn't worsened. Ellen's dressed arm unwrapped and inspected, and wrapped again fresh, because Verity did not sleep so much as rest with one eye toward whatever might need her next. By the gray hour before sunrise, the rain had thinned to nothing, and the river's roar outside the hay door had softened from a violence to a steady, tired rushing, and Verity allowed herself, for the first time since the afternoon before, to sit back fully against a hay bale and close her eyes for a handful of minutes, not sleeping, only resting, the newborn's small, even breathing somewhere nearby, the only sound she let herself listen for. The water did not fully recede for 2 more days, and when it did, it left Cedar Bend changed in the way floods change a town, the schoolhouse roof sagging where the current had pushed against it, the low bridge gone entirely, 3 homes along the creek damaged past easy repair, the mill's lower storeroom scoured clean of everything it had held. But no one had drowned. No one had gone missing. 11 children who might have been trapped on the wrong side of a rising river were dry and fed in a hayloft. A boy's twisted ankle had healed straight and clean, a young teacher's burned arm had closed without festering, and a baby who might have been born in far worse circumstances than any mother should face had come into the world safe, in clean linen, in the hands of a woman the town had always called, simply, the midwife. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Bend rebuilt what the water had taken, plank by plank, post by post, and Silas Grant, without being asked, had a proper flood bell mounted at the mill, to be rung the moment the river's color changed, because a man who has been wrong in front of the whole town does not usually make the same mistake twice. He also, quietly, began asking Verity Combs what she thought of things beyond the birthing room, the placement of the new bridge, the timing of spring planting near the creek, the small daily judgments a town makes about its own safety, because he had learned in the space of one terrible afternoon that the woman he had known for 6 years as only a midwife had been reading this land and its people far more closely than he ever had. Dolly Ferris named her daughter Grace, for reasons she never fully explained, though everyone in Cedar Bend understood well enough without asking. Tucker Vance walked with a slight limp for a month and then did not, and told the story of his ankle to anyone who would listen, always ending it the same way, that the midwife had known it wasn't broken before he did. Ellen Marsh kept a small burned scar along her forearm for the rest of her life, pale and thin, and she came to think of it not as a mark of the flood's danger, but as a mark of the afternoon she had learned, watching Verity Combs work by lantern light, what real calm under pressure actually looked like. And Verity Combs went back, in time, to her small house by the mill, to her rows of herbs and her boiled instruments, to the quiet, ordinary work of catching the next child and the one after that, unchanged in her own eyes, though the town around her would never look at her quite the same way again. There is a particular kind of mourning that comes after a flood recedes, when the mud has begun to dry pale and cracked across what used to be a road, and the whole town moves slower than usual, not from exhaustion alone, but from the strange, careful gratitude of people who understand exactly how much worse the previous day might have gone. Verity walked that morning past the schoolhouse, its roof sagging but standing, past the gap where the low bridge had been, past the mill with its scoured storeroom, and found in each place small, unhurried signs of a town choosing to rebuild rather than mourn what it had lost. Neighbors who had barely nodded to one another on an ordinary week worked shoulder to shoulder now, hauling salvaged lumber, boiling coffee over open fires for the men resetting the bridge posts, passing dry clothing hand to hand between families who had lost more than others, and Verity moved among them the way she always had, offering a bound hand here, a clean scrape there, Never ask twice for the same kindness because she never waited to be asked the first time. Ellen Marsh met her outside the schoolhouse a week later, her arms still wrapped, and asked, a little shyly, whether Verity might be willing to teach the older school children something of what she knew. Not full midwifery, nothing so far beyond their years, but the plain, practical knowledge of how to bind a sprain, how to dress a burn, how to read a river before it turned dangerous. Verity said she would think on it, and did, and by autumn there was a standing hour every other Friday afternoon when the schoolhouse's older children learned, at her direction, the kind of quiet competence that had once seemed, to the whole town, like nothing more than an ordinary midwife's ordinary business. Warren Ferris, in the weeks after, took to stopping by the mill of an evening with a jar of something Dolly had put up from the garden, honey or preserved plums, and leaving it on Verity's porch step without knocking, a small, quiet repayment for a debt he never once tried to put into words, because some debts, he seemed to understand, were better carried than spoken. Amos Teal took to sitting on Verity's porch some evenings that summer, mending his nets in comfortable silence beside her while she worked her mortar and pestle, and neither of them felt any particular need to fill the quiet with talk, because some friendships, like some knowledge, did not need to announce themselves to be real. Silas Grant rang the new flood bell only once more that year, in early June, when the river's color shifted again after a week of upstream storms, and this time the whole town moved before he'd finished the third toll, because they had learned, in one terrible afternoon in April, exactly how much a few believed minutes could matter. That June flood came and went without harm to anyone. The schoolhouse children marched calmly to high ground, long before the water reached the fence line. The Ferris barn loft readied with dry blankets and a full stove of kindling before the first drop fell. And afterward, when the danger had passed as quietly as it arrived, no one thought to remark on how smoothly it had all gone, which was, in its own way, the surest sign of how much Cedar Bend had changed since the spring before. Because sometimes the person who saves a town is not the one who shouts the loudest warning. Sometimes it is the quiet woman who has spent her whole life learning to read what a body, or a river, is trying to tell everyone else, and who is ready, when the water finally rises, to be exactly what they need.